Welcome to this explainer. You know, for 2.5 centuries, Japan existed in this state of profound, systemic peace, known as the Pax Tokugawa. But behind all those enduring pop culture myths of armored warlords, well, there lies a vastly different historical reality. Today, we're going to rely on primary sources, demographic records, and material culture to reconstruct the everyday, lived experience of the samurai. We'll look at what they actually ate, how they structured their families, and how they survived in a rapidly transforming economic landscape.
So, let's dive right into a really profound historical paradox. What exactly becomes of a hereditary warrior class when there's no war to fight? Think about it. The samurai solidified their absolute dominance right at the top of the social hierarchy, just as their primary utility, combat, completely vanished. Out of pure necessity, they had to transition. They went from being armored warlords to sword-bearing bureaucrats, administrators, and basically the custodians of civic order.
To really understand this psychological shift, historical diaries let us reconstruct their incredibly rigorous daily routine. And it started early. Long before sunrise, in the quiet, biting cold of 4 a.m., the samurai day began. But not with a war cry. No, it began with seated meditation. This anchored their whole existence in the concept of seijaku, or calm within action. Following immaculate grooming and martial arts training, the armor was, figuratively put away. By mid-morning, this fierce warrior was actually sitting at a desk, calculating agrarian tax yields and auditing domain ledgers.
And dietary records reveal a sensory reality that is far removed from our modern assumptions of elite excess. A standard foot soldier survived on a pretty modest 900 grams of unhusked rice a day, adhering strictly to the principle of ichujin sansai, which literally means one soup, three sides. A typical meal? It consisted of simple miso soup, some pickled vegetables, and maybe a modest cut of seasonal fish. Neo-Confucian ideals totally permeated this culture, framing frugality as a major virtue and equating lavish consumption with moral decay.
Now, this simplicity reveals a massive ideological contradiction right at the heart of their society. Just listen to this primary source text. The samurai eats food without growing it, uses utensils without manufacturing them, and profits without buying or selling. That quote right there provided the entire philosophical justification for their existence. See, in the Neo-Confucian hierarchy, the samurai occupied the absolute apex because they provided moral leadership, even though they were entirely dependent on the farmers and artisans below them for their actual physical survival.
So the macroeconomic reality of this administrative class was dictated by what was called the kokudaka system. And here's the kicker. Stipends were not paid in cash currency, but in fixed volumes of rice measured in koku. One koku was a really substantial physical quantity, roughly 150 kilograms. Theoretically, that was enough to sustain one adult male for an entire year. So a samurai's rank, their military obligations, and basically their family's survival were entirely dependent on the specific volume of rice allocated to them by their domain lord. Let's break this down, because demographic records expose some intense inequality within the warrior class itself. Status was strictly quantified in rice. At the top, the daimyo, the territorial lords, commanded vast wealth exceeding 100,000 koku, which sustained these massive palatial estates. Middle-ranking administrators lived comfortably on several hundred koku, but down at the bottom, the ashigaru, the foot soldiers tasked with manual labor and sentry duty, well, they survived on mere fractions of that wealth. They inhabited small, crowded quarters on the outskirts of castle towns, literally stretching every single grain to feed their dependents.
Now, you might be wondering, how did the shogunate prevent those incredibly wealthy daimyo from rebelling? Well, they implemented this highly calculated, psychologically grueling mechanism of control called sankin kotai, or alternate attendance. This forced the territorial lords to march their massive entourages back and forth between their home provinces and Edo every other year. And to make matters even more intense, their wives and children were required to remain in Edo permanently as high-status hostages. It created this inescapable system of constant surveillance, perpetual travel, and just immense psychological leverage.
The logistical burden of this system was absolutely staggering. It drained upward of 25% of the domain's entire budget. Maintaining multiple lavish residences and funding these constant cross-country processions financially devastated the lords. And as domain treasuries depleted, the stipends of their samurai retainers were inevitably slashed. This systemic financial drain wasn't an accident. It intentionally forced the proud warrior class deep into inescapable debt with the rapidly emerging urban merchant class.
But beneath all that high-level political maneuvering laid the true foundation of everyday samurai life, the ie. You see, the fundamental unit of Tokugawa society was not the individual person, it was this corporate household. Every single action a samurai took was carefully calibrated for the intergenerational survival of the house. An individual's administrative achievements, their societal failures, and, critically, their mounting debts, all of it was absorbed by the enduring eternal entity of the EA.
Managing a corporate household like that required a very strict division of labor. While the husband served as the public face, administering taxes and enduring that grueling travel to Edo we just talked about, the Okugata-sama, the wife who remained at the provincial estate, she served as the absolute domestic anchor. She wielded immense authority over the tight household finances, she supervised the domestic staff, directed the children's early education, and, if push came to shove, she was fully expected to defend the estate with lethal force. And that obligation of physical defense was not just theoretical. Enter the naginata. This weapon was a marvel of martial engineering, a heavy, long-handled polearm with a sweeping, curved blade. Its extended reach and powerful downward leverage meant a highly trained woman could completely neutralize the upper body muscular advantage of a male intruder. So she wasn't just a financial manager. She literally stood as the final, deadly line of defense for the honor and the physical survival of the E.
From a very early age, the children growing up in the Aizu were molded by this strict moral architecture. In domains like Aizu, early childhood socialization was strictly governed by the Ju no Okite, the rules for samurai children. It instilled bravery, honesty, and this deep, deep respect for elders. But the ultimate moral baseline was this beautifully uncompromising directive. Do not do anything you must not do. Violating that code brought immense collective shame and was penalized by social ostracization, which, as you can imagine, was a devastating consequence in such a deeply collectivist culture.
As these children grew up, the actual physical architecture of their education strictly maintained this class segregation. Elite domain schools, known as the Hanko, were exclusively for male samurai. They focused on Chinese classics, statecraft, and intense martial arts, like, believe it or not, combative swimming. Meanwhile, temple schools, or terrakoya, served the commoners and the impoverished samurai, offering highly practical instruction in mathematics and literacy. But together, this dual structure inadvertently forged one of the most highly literate populations on Earth, which totally laid the groundwork for Japan's future modernization.
Yet, despite all their elite education and inherited status, the samurai were being slowly crushed by this invisible economic paradigm. Think about it. Their income remained locked in fixed volumes of rice, even as Edo Japan was blossoming into a heavily cash-driven, rapidly inflating consumer economy. As the purchasing power of rice plummeted, the undisputed sword-bearing masters of the social order found themselves trapped in a gilded cage of inescapable poverty. The desperation grew so profound that destitute samurai would actually covertly sell their hereditary family status to wealthy merchants merely to survive.
So how did they sustain their families when those stipends failed? Well, lower-ranking samurai had to swallow their pride and turn to naishoku, clandestine supplementary labor and cottage industries. With their lord's quiet permission, these warriors engaged in labor that was considered far beneath their station. Some worked the soil as agricultural farmhands, while others leveraged their elite literacy to instruct the sons of affluent merchants. Many actually transformed their humble residences into miniature workshops, painstakingly manufacturing things like wooden umbrellas, traditional toys, and intricately designed lanterns.
The material culture from this era really reveals the meticulous nature of this supplementary work. I want you to picture this. A hardened warrior, sitting in a cramped room, engaged in the precise, highly sensory process of crafting a goldfish lantern. Stretching delicate red and white Japanese paper over a thin frame, they'd apply hot wax to seal the surface, carefully paint intricate patterns, and finally attach delicate fins and bold black eyes. These impoverished administrators basically channeled their intense discipline and aesthetic refinement into a miniature world of paper and glue, maintaining a quiet dignity right in the midst of economic humiliation.
Yet, as unbelievably difficult as life was for an impoverished samurai manufacturing paper goods, it completely paled in comparison to their deepest, darkest societal fear, becoming a ronin. A ronin was a wave man, a drifter, completely severed from a master. If a lord died without an heir, or the shogunate confiscated a domain for a political infraction, those retainers lost everything. Stripped of their rice stipend, their social rank, and their geographic stability, they were cast right out of the protective architecture of the EA and thrown into a society that literally had no systemic place for them anymore.
Without the structural support of a domain, survival on the margins was exceedingly grim.
These masterless drifters had to reside in transient lodgings or highly restricted tenements. To survive, they frequently had to leverage their only remaining asset, their capacity for violence. They served as mercenaries, bodyguards, or martial arts instructors for the very same merchant class they nominally outranked. Others, driven entirely by starvation, shaved their heads to enter the priesthood, or abandoned their honor entirely to engage in highway banditry.
All of this leaves us with a final, provocative historical reflection. What does true resilience actually look like when an entire way of life becomes obsolete? The samurai, they didn't just vanish when the battlefields fell silent. They adapted. They transitioned into administration, they navigated crippling financial structures, they fiercely defended their estates, and they reinvented their labor against truly impossible odds. It challenges all of us to consider how human societies adapt when the very foundation of their daily reality shifts permanently. Thank you so much for joining me to explore the everyday reality of the Pax Tokugawa. Keep questioning the past, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.